the amount of money that China's been investing in the BRI has dramatically fallen. Part of that has to do with the pressure the Chinese economy is on. Part of it has to do with the devaluation of the yuan. But part of it also has to do with the fact that a lot of recipient countries are getting a lot smarter about this thing, and China's had a chance to have a second think about their approach. Because, the steamroller approach and basically, heads I win, tails you lose kind of thing doesn't really work for very long for most countries. And they get smarter to it, and then they stop agreeing to do certain things.
That's Daniel Wagner, and this is the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome and welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. I'm Ben Catania, your host. This is my show. This is a show all about understanding and embracing risk and uncertainty in our lives and in the world around us. Today, we welcome back to the show Daniel Wagner, who's been on here several times. Daniel is a geopolitical risk expert. He's the CEO of Country Risk Solutions. He's written numerous books about China, virtual terror, risk management, and a variety of other topics. And on this episode, Daniel joins me from Abidjan in the Côte d'ivoire in West Africa, where he is on assignment. And we recorded this about a month ago, so mid-October 2019. And this episode is a check-in on the state of the world, particularly geopolitics, but also a lot more around that. And we cover things like the China-US trade war, Greta Thunberg and the state of climate change, the trend of party over country in Western democracies, particularly the US and the UK, Donald Trump and foreign policy, China, development, the Belt and Road Initiative, sustainability, Hong Kong. We get into Russia, election security. We touch on Eliud Kipchoge and a variety of things you might not have heard about, especially as they relate to Africa. So let's check in on the world. Here is Daniel Wagner. Daniel, welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. Always a pleasure to have you on, and I'm sure we are going to be treated to some very interesting insights. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, Ben. Thanks for having me on again.
So I thought that we could perhaps start with a very easy question, which is, how's the world doing, man? How are we doing geopolitically? What are you watching? What are the things that concern you? All of that good stuff.
Well, I gave a speech a couple of months ago in Chicago, and I started off by saying it's a great time to be alive for a very simple reason. If you're a political scientist, you don't want nothing going on in the world. And if you're a risk manager, you definitely want something to do. So from a risk management and a political science perspective, I'm in hog heaven. This is great. Well, I mean, what can you say? I've been living for a few months in Côte d'Ivoire on assignment, and I guess I've grown tired of apologizing to people by virtue of the fact that I'm an American, because they always ask my nationality. So I've just started saying I'm Canadian, because I can't even say I'm British now, right? I mean, it's like, there's that stuff going on as well. So
we have elections in Canada very, very shortly. Probably they will have happened once this goes out. So be careful. You might have to change your tune as well, depending on what happens.
Well, that's right. And it's not like that one hasn't been without scandal.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just the new normal. I mean, I guess you could look at it this way. I think we're fortunate in a sense that we don't just have one or even two major national leaders who are perhaps either slightly unhinged or have married nationalism and populism to maximize disruption. As you know, there are a whole series of leaders around the world who have done that, which means when a certain president in a certain country, starting with U and ending with A, happens to do something that people think is a little nutty, he's not the only one doing it. It's just that he's more successful at making sure the news cycle is focused on him 24/7, 365. That all said, I say we feel a little fortunate in the sense that by all accounts, if you think about all the things that have gone wrong and who's at the helm and all the dynamics at play in the world right now, we're not in a bad way. The global economy is doing okay. The American economy certainly continues to do okay. But we're not in a crisis anywhere. Just look at what happened with Iran and Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago. I mean, previously, that would have led to a major regional war. But the dynamics of the world being what they are, astonishingly, it did not. And I thought the Saudis exercised incredible restraint in not immediately attacking back as soon as they had the evidence. And it looks like that's not going to happen now. Seems like Iran was playing a very interesting game here, which is basically to say, let's do the most outlandish thing we can think of and dare them to attack us because of all the things that would mean. And let's not forget that in Yemen, they've sort of got something going on in their backyard, and they're a little preoccupied. And I find myself wondering, whether the dynamics that are at play from a potential regional war would actually be well in Iran's favor, given all the proxies that they have around the region, et cetera. So, I mean, maybe have some more specific questions, but those are my initial thoughts.
Right. Well, let's maybe discuss the trade war and the China-US dynamic perhaps a little bit, because that force, that axis, that whatever you want to call it, that relationship is, as you've written about extensively, is determining a lot of what's going on in the world. You've came out with your book, China Vision, earlier this year. What's happened since that book has come out and since we last spoke in terms of that relationship?
Well, first off, the book was well received in large part because it's an intellectually honest look at the question of what China is doing in the world. And I was criticized from some quarters by saying this is China bashing and all that stuff. And I'm unapologetic as being an American. You know what side of the coin I'm likely to be on that subject. But it's not like the topic has become less relevant with time. With every week and month that passes and soon year that passes, that's going to be the case. So what I see is that we've reached the point, if the headlines from last week turn out to be the case, that I think both sides have sort of become exhausted with this whole thing. And they're trying to find a way to stop the hemorrhaging and then slowly, gradually find a way to reach an equilibrium. This is likely to take probably not even months, but years, not only because of the scope of the problem, but because of how the two negotiate. And the Chinese are very shrewd negotiators. The Americans are no dummies either. And so I think they've staked out their positions, and they're not likely to back down. That's part of the problem, right? They both sort of force themselves into a corner, and they don't really have the ability to stop waving the flag at a moment's notice. Their populations now are expecting them to follow through with their various perspectives. And I think it's reasonable to assume that some of the habits of consumers on both sides of the Pacific have probably changed in a semi-permanent way, meaning, this has gone on long enough, a year and a half or whatever it's been since the trade war came to a boil. And people have said, I'm not buying product from either of those countries anymore, or I'm finding alternative sources or alternative export markets, whatever the case may be. And they're finding it because it's a big world out there. But it's very simplistic, I think. I thought a year or so ago, too, for the American side to simply say, well, they export 5 times as much as we do to them, so that means we're going to win this thing. It's just not that simple. It's extremely multifaceted. But what we're witnessing is, the change of global trade patterns before our eyes. I don't know that everybody necessarily thinks of it in those terms, but I do.
Mm-hmm. And what are the medium to longer term implications of that? Because presumably there's, even though we have this trade war, as you say, the global economy is doing relatively well. Does that get threatened?
I think it's all part of the same pie, Ben. And I think we long ago understood that we've sort of decoupled in one sense and not decoupled at all in another sense from all the various pieces of the pie that come in to make the global economy, politics, economics, technology, environment, et cetera. And they're all coming right along. I find it so interesting, though, how one young woman from Sweden, Greta Thunberg, can have such a dramatic impact on the climate debate. I mean, she's an incredible young woman, and how she's been able to mobilize young people and get right to the top of the corridors of power in no time at all through, social media. It's just been astonishing. We need more people like that, who are not afraid to say, "How dare you," right, to all these people who are whittling away young people's future and not even thinking about it. We need a lot more people like that.
That's been an interesting set of developments. And I don't know what your take is on the Climate Action Summit. I was cautiously optimistic by the number of promises that were made, whether or not we have some follow through. But you're right that example of Greta is, I think it's inspiring, but hopefully it inspires other people to just be able to speak truth to power. We don't have enough of that certainly not in terms of political leaders.
Yeah, I'd have to agree in general. And part of the reason for that is, as the rise of authoritarianism has grown around the world, people actually pay consequences for speaking up in some countries these days, where they might not have previously, or maybe not as much. One of the things that's astonishing to me in that regard, and I'm speaking as an independent from a voting perspective in America. I'm not either pro-Democrat or pro-Republican, but what I find astonishing is how few Republicans are just saying anything at all to object to anything that President Trump does. It's just mind-boggling to me. And it seems to me, as this election approaches next year in the States, that they're potentially sacrificing not only, whatever moral compass they might have, but they're sacrificing the future of their party, because people are going to remember that Mr. Trump was able to get away with literally anything, legal, illegal, moral, immoral. And these folks said absolutely nothing. I just find it mind-boggling.
It's party over country, and it's something we see in the UK and loads of other places, but they've never been presented with an entity like Donald Trump before. So
no, and some of the boundaries that have been crossed, the legal boundaries, the moral boundaries, etc. I mean, it's not that it's never happened before, but just that the presumption always was that when those boundaries were crossed, there would be a price to pay. And everybody is accustomed to the idea of crossing a boundary and then moving back again. But the boundaries in this case seem to just be perpetually crossed, and it just becomes a larger and larger boundary to the extent that you have to wonder whether there is one at all.
Do you think he survives?
The irony is he probably will, because you mean the impeachment effort?
The impeachment effort, and when we spoke, I think last time we were talking about the Russia investigation, and you said, hey, he's like a mob boss. He's not going to have any breadcrumbs leading right to him. And I think that proved to be quite accurate. But now there's a different threat to his presidency.
Well, and of course, all of this is self-imposed. But if you look at the history of impeachment in America, there have been, 3 cases, I think, where it's happened. And there's been no removal from office. The latest polls in the States, and this one comes from Fox News, which is really interesting, is that actually the majority by 1%, 51%, would like him to not only be impeached but removed. So whether that's enough to get Moscow Mitch to change his tune, I don't know. But it's fascinating for me to watch all of this now for the last several months from a place like Côte d'Ivoire, because I find that whenever I'm living abroad, I'm able to detach myself a little bit to what's going on. And, the media is so good at cramming all this stuff down everybody's throat and perpetuating the 24/7, 365 news cycle. Of course, we can turn it off anytime we want. But it's nice here, because if I don't want to watch that, I can watch anything else in French.
Well, before we go into some of that in terms of talking about Africa and developing countries, you wrote a piece on Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy and what we shouldn't or should expect. And I thought that was very interesting. That Donald doesn't really have an ideology. He doesn't really have a coherent policy even. And that makes it interesting. We were talking earlier about the U.S. being pretty good negotiators when it comes to China, but I guess that's just the infrastructure that's already in place that's trying to advance and protect American interests. Where does the Donald come out on foreign policy?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think there is some method to the madness, and I know most people are tempted to say that it doesn't look like there is. There is obviously in his own mind, and a lot of the things apparently he does, and he doesn't even liaise with anyone else. But he seems to have his eye on the ball in some respects, in that you can just take this recent action with the Kurds in Turkey, in Syria. Well, that was not done by accident. He wants to be able to disengage from Syria. He wants to be able to repair relations with Turkey at the same time. For him, the calculus appears to be that there's very little price to be paid by abandoning the Kurds. It's happened before, unfortunately for the Kurds, not only by us, by other powers. And when I say us, I mean the Americans. I know I'm speaking to people from all over the world, so I don't mean to be, too self-focused on that. But what I mean to say is that if this turns out not to be a calamity, and probably it won't be, it'll be a calamity for the Kurds, of course. But in terms of international relations, if he can disengage with Syria and then repair America's relationship with Turkey, and basically Syria already belongs to Iran, so I don't think he probably felt he was giving much up, then maybe the pluses outweigh the minuses in the longer term. That remains, of course, to be seen. But I think a lot of foreign policy analysts get in the habit of simply saying, oh, this is just a terrible thing, and he didn't think it through, and it's going to turn out to be a disaster. Well, most of the things he's done have not turned out to be a disaster. And a lot of that may have less to do with him than with the reaction of the people who are impacted by those decisions. But I did write another piece a few weeks ago in which I basically recommended that people in the foreign policy analysis business stop writing about Donald Trump, because I called it a fool's errand. Their chances of being correct are almost nil. It's just a question of time until the next erratic move. And then you end up inevitably being wrong at some point in time. So I was just recommending that they stop writing about him at all in the foreign policy arena, because I think it's too much of an honorable profession to be left in the path of destruction that he is leaving behind. And I would like for foreign policy analysts to be able to pick up where they left off and hold their heads high.
Yeah. But there are always a few that cannot resist temptation. So it's sometimes interesting to parse out what's good analysis and what's not good analysis. Let's maybe shift gears a little bit and talk a bit about the role of multilateral development banks and investment. And also we've talked about China and One Belt, One Road and two different approaches, and where all of that goes in terms of investment in developing countries.
Yeah, so this seems to be a bit of a moving target as well. The BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, has been in some respects a fantastic success, in other respects a total disaster for certain countries who've fallen into this debt trap diplomacy issue, wherein, China lends them all this money knowing they can't pay it back, and then they can't pay it back, and then the assets get expropriated and belongs to China then, and the relations become soured, and it often ends up in a mess that way. But what has happened, I've been looking at the statistics actually just today, is that since last year, the amount of money that China's been investing in the BRI has dramatically fallen. Part of that has to do with the pressure the Chinese economy is on. Part of it has to do with the devaluation of the yuan. But part of it also has to do with the fact that a lot of recipient countries are getting a lot smarter about this thing, and China's had a chance to have a second think about their approach. Because the steamroller approach and basically, heads I win, tails you lose kind of thing doesn't really work for very long for most countries. And they get smarter to it, and then they stop agreeing to do certain things. China now, I still maintain a decade ago, and I certainly say it now, this is their century. There's no question in my mind they're going to be number one in so many categories in the next decade. And don't forget, the next decade begins in about 2 months. So, honestly, they've broken through so many of the projections about when they'll be the largest economy. Well, they aren't yet the largest economy, but they will be probably within 5 years. When they're going to land on the moon, when they're going to be the leader in AI, when they're going to do all these various things. They're just incredible. When they put their mind to doing something, they just put the resources forward and they just go ahead and do it. That's one of the things I admire about the Chinese. That all said, the dynamics are changing for them and for lots of other entities that are trading and investing with them. And the BRI, I think, is going to be a net positive for most countries once they get the formula right. I guess my question becomes, will China be as interested in the BRI if and when it's determined that it's not necessarily all going to be to their advantage?
Right. And when we talked about this before, you see, and before your view was there's a space for, I guess, Western-based models of development and the Chinese approach. What should Western-based or multilateral development institutions be thinking about?
Well, as we know, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the New Development Bank, the NDB, they're already success stories. And these are both based on, China hosting them or being instrumental in their formation or funding them in a big way like they do the AIIB. That all said, the objective originally was to sort of take up excess capacity that the MDBs themselves may not be meeting, particularly in the infrastructure arena in so much of the developing world and certainly in Asia. They're heading in the right direction on that. There's just a huge gap in infrastructure financing. And so, I don't think we could devote enough dollars because something like a $170 billion gap that grows every year in this subject. And it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I'm a fan of anything the MDBs can do to make more investment happen in the developing world, but particularly also by engaging with institutional investors who've been somewhat hesitant to devote a lot of capital because they perceive that there's so much risk in doing so. But I ran across an interesting statistic the other day, which basically is a graph which showed the default rates for various infrastructure projects by region. And interesting to me was to note that Africa's default rate for infrastructure was far less than most of the other areas of the world. The reason for this, in large part, is because projects that get funded in Africa for infrastructure are vetted so very well that they would never get funded if they weren't good projects. And that connection actually makes a lot of sense. Not that the MDBs or anyone else are sloughing off with other parts of the world, but it's like Africa has to jump through a special set of hoops. And of course, perhaps Africa needs this more than anyone else because the gap is so large there, but there's a huge gap everywhere in the world. I'm just hopeful that the MDBs will find a way to unlock even more capital so that they can catalyze this investment and start putting a real dent in this gap.
Could I ask a very basic question? And I imagine some of my listeners have the same question. But how do projects like this make money? You talk about investment. So if it's a port, if it's a road, if it's an airport, how do investors get their money back? And how do you project anything like that?
Well, that's really the trick, is that are the projection models likely to be accurate? And of course, they go through various scenarios, high and low and middle, and they figure there's a better than equal chance that, X, Y, or Z scenario is going to happen. I'll give you an example. Back in my days living in the Philippines, the Asian Development Bank was working on a big project to put in a new metro system in Manila. And this was an above-ground rail. And they went through all the projection and everything, but one of the things they didn't think about or didn't factor in well enough was the idea that there would be, a multitude of people who, despite the idea of getting to work in a cleaner, faster, more pleasant way by taking the metro, would actually not want to continue to do that because they actually could still save a noteworthy sum by continuing to take jeepneys to work. And I guess as the middle class grows in a place like the Philippines, you naturally assume that people would want to change their behavior. But it turns out that a lot of them did not want to. And as a result, it became a bit of a challenge for that particular project to make its revenue. There's also a presumption when you put in a new power plant that people are actually going to buy the power and that it's going to be at an affordable enough manner for people to be able to afford it. But what ends up happening in so many places is that the power turns out not to be as routinely delivered as one might expect, or because of the various forces in the local economy or in the government, whatever it might be. The power that they thought they were going to be able to deliver at 6 cents per kilowatt hour suddenly became 10 cents per kilowatt hour, and it just blows all the projections. So I think a big part of it is creating the enabling environment so that local governments can actually be able to deliver what it is they said they would deliver. A lot of times they want to deliver it this way, but they run out of resources or money, or something just isn't quite right, and then things sort of fall apart.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I do know about some of the World Bank funded projects and so forth is there are a huge amount of environmental and social standards and safeguards around pollution and carbon footprint and social impacts and so forth. And conversely, I don't think any of the BRI or any of the Chinese funded ones would have the same standards. In fact, that's probably the point of contention. We were earlier talking about climate change. We're talking about climate change, but we're also talking about a number of countries that do need some basic infrastructure for economic growth and development. And where do you come down on this idea of environmental and social safeguards versus the need for development and therefore creating a bigger carbon footprint in a place like Africa?
Sure. Well, the ESG movement, the environmental social governance movement, has really caught fire around the world. And even the Chinese now are really on the bandwagon and have become big proponents of this stuff. But the MDBs, just so everyone understands, they really cannot fund or participate in projects which do not satisfy the common standard being the World Bank environmental guidelines. And many of the world's largest banks also follow this type of approach. And that being the case, there is then a minimum threshold of the things that have to be agreed to. And I'm actually not aware of when these were last updated, but of course they are and should be regularly updated. The point being that once we reached the Equator Principles, which means the commercial banks, agree to abide by this, and once the MDBs have their standards in place, that's not exactly going to go away. One of the criticisms that's been made of China is that they don't pay enough attention to this, and my research has indicated that there are some cases in which they have not, but overall they're pretty switched on, because the last thing that they want to be perceived as is missing the boat on something so fundamental. And in fact, and I don't really want to make this yet again about a conversation about China, but it's pertinent, and they're really making great strides in transforming their economy from this really dirty coal to green technology, wind and solar. They've really embraced it. They're really starting to turn things around, and their own carbon footprint in the power sector is going to start to be reversed in a meaningful way by the middle of the coming decade. So they're headed in the right direction, and I'm hoping that future climate agreements will actually have more teeth and more enforcement than the COP Paris Agreement did. It's not like this stuff is going away. Everybody feels the effects every day. Tokyo is just about to be hit by the strongest storm in 60 years this weekend. So it's front and center almost every week now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think risk is the lens through which some of this change can happen, Daniel. When I was working in the Philippines, I worked on a number of these kinds of projects, and the ones that really didn't take care of the environmental and the social side also had loads of political risk and community protests and local government interference, because you create a grievance, and then you create a grievance, and it means that all kinds of people with a vested interest have an incentive to take advantage of that. In China, there are protests. They're largely environmental protests, aren't they?
That's right. There's no shortage of them. And now that the government has made the decision to start switching away from coal in a meaningful fashion, those types of protests are fortunately becoming less robust and less frequent. But it's not like they've stopped. They're still building. There's a lot of things that were on the drawing board before COP 21 happened and the subsequent talks. And so it's going to be an ongoing issue into the new decade.
It is. And it does require people who are impacted by these things to be able to speak up. So it's certainly not black and white.
Completely agree.
They'll speak up in one way or other as well. So whether that's through legitimate means or illegitimate means, but there is a pattern to human behavior when someone comes in and dirties your backyard.
We're all sensitive to that. Nobody likes it.
Yeah. We didn't talk about Hong Kong. I'd love to get your perspective on what's happening there.
Sure. I think actually the Chinese government has shown great restraint. 10 years ago, perhaps, they would have just, after the first weekend of protests, sort of brought the troops in and settled the score, no matter what the agreement they made with the British when the handover took place was. I think their calculus at this stage probably is that with each weekend that goes by, there's somewhat fewer people who are protesting. Yes, they're the hardcore ones, and it's been getting increasingly violent with every weekend that passes. But I don't really understand why they didn't just remove Carrie Lam to begin with. Why are they holding on to Carrie Lam? What is so important about her? They could solve a big part of the problem by removing her and promising never to put that law back again that started this whole process. I still don't understand why they didn't do that. Where do I think it's going to end tomorrow? No. I think it's going to go likely well into the new year based on what I've seen. I mean, it's not like people are suddenly just going to stop coming out on the weekends. I think the longer term is the issue. Like, how long will Beijing basically say we'll tolerate this type of dissent in Hong Kong that we would never tolerate at home? They do realize that there are some stakes, very high stakes, in fact, at hand with the idea of playing with Hong Kong sovereignty. And if they didn't think that, they would have done something else weeks ago.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds and what might happen over the long and the medium term. What's going on with one other country we didn't talk about, Russia?
Yes. Everyone's favorite. Well, I think we can rely on them to do in the 2020 U.S. election what they did so successfully in the 2016, because America hasn't made nearly enough progress on election security. The only way that they're really going to solve that problem, by the way, is go back to old-fashioned paper ballots. If they take away electronic voting, you don't have the problem anymore, except, of course, that the Russians appear to be messing with the American voters' mind on social media in the process. But if 4 years later Americans have become a little smarter about that, some of them will have, some of them will never be smarter about that. It should be less of an issue. It was a similar issue in 2018. There's nothing fundamental that's changed in election security. I think some states have become smarter. The government is working toward making the system safer, but we're not there yet. It's just going to take maybe one or two more cycles before we're there, if we're allocating the money that's necessary to actually make that happen. I spoke about that in my book, Virtual Terror, and how very simple it was in 2016 to do what they did. And I said at the time, what's the greater outrage? The fact that the Russians did it, or the fact that it was so easy for them to do it? I can't say any differently in this next election cycle, unfortunately.
In fact, Facebook's come under some pressure for saying that as long as a candidate pays, they're not going to vet the messages for facts and truth.
Well, there is that pesky thing about freedom of speech in the U.S. Constitution. So I guess there's the assumption that the average American voter is going to be smart enough to see what's fact and what's fiction. But then, of course, another part of the problem is that this gets more and more challenging to address, because the people who want to cause a problem get smarter and smarter, and all they have to do is get through the system, and then they're off to the races. And of course, it's not like the average person vis-a-vis social media is consuming less. They're consuming more. We're all glued to our phones. You have these family of four, at a restaurant, all four of them are on their phones. I mean, it's just crazy what's happened to our social norms as a result.
Yes, and I suppose critical thinking is really the one of the key skills that is lacking amongst all of us, perhaps. But certainly in a time of election, asking that question, is this true? Where has this come from a reputable source? Does this add up? Does it make sense?
Well, and unfortunately, and I don't mean to offend millennials or Gen Zers too much, but if it's not on YouTube, they're not going to watch it. And, they're really not generally trained to be critical thinkers. And that's a big part of the problem we have with our education system these days, is not producing people who are thinking critically. And until and unless that changes, this problem just gets worse.
It does. Yes. We've covered a fair bit of ground here in our semi-annual checkpoint on the state of the world. Were there other things that are on your radar that you wanted to mention we didn't get a chance to talk about?
It occurs to me that there's a lot of things that go on in much of the rest of the world that just never make headlines, but means a lot to a lot of other people. I mean, most of the listeners, for instance, are not going to be aware of this 159 movement that's been going on in Kenya to encourage this national Kenyan to, complete a marathon in under 2 hours.
Which he did.
And he did. Yes. He did that. And, when somebody who's Kenyan here asked me if I was aware of the campaign, at the time I hadn't been, but of course all of them were. And I guess it boils down to there's a lot of stuff that's going on all over the world that we never even hear or think about. There's an election that's going on here in Cote d'Ivoire next year that has a lot of people a little anxious given the history this country had and the fact that their second civil war of this century only ended 4 years ago. People are very, very concerned about that. And I guess I just raised that to say that we tend to be a little bit geocentric about how we focus on the news and listen to it and seek it out. But I'm mindful, living in a place like this, that it's not just about Europe and North America and China. There's a lot of stuff going on everywhere that most of us have no conception of.
We didn't even talk about the Côte d'Ivoire. What is going on with the election, and what are some of what's the mood there?
So this is, of course, on paper, a functional democracy, and this was a former French colony. In fact, the apartment I'm living in overlooks the French embassy, so I'm reminded of it every day. But what's happened is that this election's coming up next year, and the party that got in, they got in 2015 following the end of the Civil War, and there's this 5-year term. And so in most functional democracies, people will say, okay, it's time for an election, may the best man win, or woman. But here, it seems to be more like, well, you had your turn, so guess what? Next year starts my turn. And that really is because it's a question mark whether it'll go that way or not. And that has a lot of people sort of concerned about whether it'll open the door to bloodletting again. But also what's interesting to me about living here, there's many interesting things, but one in particular is that when I first got here, I sort of wondered what the security environment was going to be like. And it turns out, I live in Abidjan through January at this point, and I feel perfectly safe here. I didn't exactly know what to expect because I hadn't either visited or lived in West Africa before. And I suppose I wasn't exactly sure what I was getting into, but let me tell you, the streets are hand swept every morning. The streets are cleaner here than they are in many places I've been in the world, including in developed countries. People stop for stop signs and red lights, and people are very polite, and you just don't have any sense that there's a problem here. I think people here are just very, very tired of having so many years of conflict, and they just don't want any more.
Yeah, I've never been to the Côte d'Ivoire. I have been to French West Africa, and places that you're right. I felt totally safe walking around in Cotonou in Benin, even in a place like in Guinea. I felt totally, just absolutely safe. But there are obviously there are histories in a number of these places and rifts that I suppose that justifiably people are concerned they would those tensions would bubble up as they would. Let me just say one more, if I may, Ben. Let me just say one more thing about that. I say how there's a feeling of safety here, et cetera, but it is worth noting that
this country happens to be surrounded by 5 other countries, and 2 of them are Mali and Burkina Faso. And there's a very significant Islamic State and Al-Qaeda problem in these countries, and it has bubbled over here. In 2016, there was an unfortunate attack on a place called Bassam, which is about 30 minutes from here, the most popular beach in the country, where a number of people died. So they determined that people from IS from Mali were responsible for that. And everyone said that was sort of one and done, never happened before, never happened since. But I subsequently learned just a few weeks ago that there was a thwarted attempt on a major hotel here in Abidjan by Mali and IS back in June. So that's sort of lingering in the background here. And it sort of inspired me to co-author a piece from last month where I talked about the looming threat of IS and AQ in Burkina. And if you look at the papers, every weekend there seems to be new killings that were attributable to these folks. So that's an issue. And also, I do think that there's a considerable risk that there will be a resurgence of IS as a result of what's now going on in Syria and as a result of the idea of virtual jihad, which of course has been bubbling in the background in cyberspace all along. And the fact that there are these cells in these failed states in places with porous borders, and that really does mean that the risk from these groups is going to linger for some time to come.
That's very astute. And when we talk about terrorism, living in the West, I'm always a little bit skeptical of some of the headlines, just because looking at the statistics, you're more likely to get run over by a car watch you crossing the road. But in certain environments, that's actually, depending on where you are and where you venture, probabilities go up, way up.
They do indeed.
Let's go back to China for a moment. China is still considered a developing country with regard to multilateral development banks and still receives funding, and yet they're doing their own development initiatives, which seems like a contradiction until I suppose you realize the amount of capital that needs to go somewhere. When do we say enough is enough?
That's a really good question, Ben. Earlier this year, Trump appointed David Malpass to be the new head of the World Bank. And one of the reasons that he did was he wanted to encourage the World Bank and the other MDBs to think differently about what they're doing with China. This is a bit of a complicated issue because, as you appreciate, China remains the top recipient of loans and other forms of assistance from a number of the MDBs, and it's been their largest client for many years. One of the reasons that they continue to do it, even though it's pretty clear, China really no longer has the ability to say that it's a, quote, poor developing country, is because these MDBs have so much capacity that they're giving to China. What are they going to do with this capacity if China doesn't take it? So many of the world's poorest countries do not have the capacity to absorb this stuff. And so I guess it really ultimately points to the raison d'etre in certain respects of the MDBs themselves. If they're not willing to change their model to accommodate to new realities, well, do they need to be forced to? And that's part of what Malpass's objective is. That all said, China has been, as I think we've discussed in the past, masterful at calling itself both a developed and a developing country. And despite the fact that they've lifted so many hundreds of millions of their own people very successfully out of abject poverty over the last several decades, they still say, well, we've got this need and we've got that need. And I guess as long as they can say that, maybe there might be some reason to allocate any type of resource to them. But as they're the second largest economy with the largest accumulation of foreign exchange, and they're a lender in their own right, I mean, it really just becomes, in my mind, a silly argument. There's so many countries that really, really need the resources of the MDBs, and China's just sucking up a lot of oxygen in the room. So I think it's going to be incumbent upon the banks themselves to, make this realization and say, we really can't do this anymore. I'm hoping that the next decade will be the time when that transition occurs. But I guess part of me is saying it's going to be a long, long time until China is completely removed from that picture.
It will be quite mixed. Actually, we didn't really talk about anything in the kind of virtual terror / cyberspace and the role of technology. It hasn't been that long since we last covered this, but has there been anything in that space that has surprised you, or any new developments with regard to whether that's cyber attacks or technology that has emerged? I mean, the role of maybe 5G. Everything's going to be super connected now with 5G. Has anything occurred that has shifted your views on virtual terror?
No, it's only gotten worse with time. I think what a lot of people may not realize where 5G is concerned is it's not just about having faster and better internet. What this really is about is, if you will, a battle for the future. The reason that Huawei became the issue that it did is not merely because of security issues when governments are using Huawei technology. And in that regard, I find it mind-boggling that governments like the UK and Germany are still saying that they are happy to use Huawei products, knowing what they know about it by being, having shared intelligence with the US. I mean, Australia and New Zealand and one or two other countries have agreed with the US posture on this. I think the stakes are so high that I don't really see how any Western government could agree to be using Huawei technology in that regard. And it's not just about the security associated with state secrets. It's also about the data. It's the amount of data that any of these 5G providers are going to be able to access is absolutely staggering. And as we know, in this century, it's all about the data. The entities that have the data have the power. And if people think about it in those terms, I think they would say, I would sort of rather that maybe my country was my provider for 5G technology rather than China. But then it raises the question, well, who's providing 5G in the West? I mean, there are a couple of options, like Nokia and one or two others, but apart from that, who are they? I'm not even aware of a single American provider that actually is in the space in a meaningful way. And also, being in a place like this, you see, there aren't so many Apple phones here. There's a lot of Huawei phones and a lot of Google phones and whatnot, Android. And that's what most of the world is using. Most of the world is not using an enclosed ecosystem like Apple. They're using, these Huawei phones, and they don't even think about this stuff. It's not even in their DNA. They're saying, it's a beautiful new phone. It's got a flashy screen. It's nice and bright, and it does all these great things. I don't really care about the rest. And I suppose that must be one of the things Huawei is banking on.
Well, that's what the vast majority of human beings will use because, the given populations and demographics.
Well, but that's the other thing here, right? I mean, in many parts of the world, people just aren't concerned about anything like this. They're saying, how can I get the best phone for the cheapest? And does it do the same thing more or less that all the other more expensive phones do? If it does, that's the one I'm going to go with.
And increasingly, yes, that's the case. It's harder to justify a more expensive product, whether it's an iPhone or a Samsung or whatever, just because it might have a camera that's higher resolution.
Well, that's right. And how many people in the developing world can afford to spend $1,200 on a phone? Not a lot is the short answer.
Indeed.
So I guess, the Huaweis of the world are banking that's going to continue for some time to come. I don't think that virtual terror has become less of an issue. And as we've spoken about before, I think China is only becoming a more omnipotent force in the AI arena with every month and year that passes. They're doing some amazing things, and they deserve to be the leader. They're spending the most money. They're putting the most effort. They may be doing some things in a bit unscrupulous manner, but again, that goes back to the question, well, why do we necessarily, on the other side of the coin, make it so easy for them to purloin IP and technology? If it wasn't so easy to do, they wouldn't be doing it quite so much, would they?
No.
So two sides to that sword.
Could we? I want to really shift gears for just a moment before we finish off, and I wanted to know, in the course of the work that you've done, or because of, not necessarily in the course of, but because of the work that you've done and that you do, are there certain things, certain lessons that you've learned around managing your own risks or making decisions in your own personal and professional life that you've taken forward?
Well, I'll tell you this. It's easy to become complacent when we're living in a London or a New York or wherever we might be in the developed world. There are just certain things we take for granted we don't even think about. And I do, certainly find myself adapting to a new surrounding like I have here. I think it's important that we not lose sight of the perpetual risks that are all around us all the time. And it should not take a cataclysmic event or a disaster or an unfortunate example of timing being in the wrong time or wrong place for us to remember that we have to have our guard up at all time. I mean, I was just speaking to a friend from South Africa yesterday, and I'm going to be going to Johannesburg next month, and I've never been to Joburg, but he said anywhere in South Africa, it's not just in Joburg, you cannot take your phone out in public. You cannot have a laptop in a coffee shop, have a laptop sitting in your car, in a locked car, because people will break the window or snatch it right from out from under your hands or your arms. We don't have to think about that in so many places in the world. And it's a daily reality for so many. So I just think we need to stay vigilant.
Yeah, I think there's a great lesson in that. Certainly in the West, we're becoming so detached from how things get produced or what the risks to anything are. And it's the same with where our food gets produced, or we have this culture of convenience. I can just buy something on Amazon. It might be with me in a few hours. And we lose. I'm a regular cyclist, so I see this behavior from drivers. You've got drivers that are in these metal boxes. They've got the radio going. They're looking at their phones. They don't really understand the damage that their big metal box can do to a vulnerable road user. And I see behavior that's because of this culture of convenience, that we take a lot of things for granted in the West, whereas if you are in a place like Abidjan, there's a little bit, there's less of that. People are a little more switched on.
That's exactly right. And I thought about some of the postings that you've made on Facebook about your wonderful cycling experiences and some of these mountains you go up and down. Now, you talk about a risk taker. You may not even think about it in those terms, but those types of risks most people would never even take.
No, and one of the things that you, just to also switch gears to things like mountains, is the amount of temperature change you get from the bottom to the top, and then how cold you can get just riding down. You're not pedaling, and you become incredibly cold unless you're wearing the right things. And we're not getting outdoors enough. We're not sensitive enough to these types of just weather changes, and for centuries human beings have been exposed to. I think staying vigilant is the appropriate way of expressing that. And also, it's not just staying vigilant, but also there's a joy in being outside and being exposed to these things, and just reminding ourselves that, hey, we are vulnerable. The world is not made of just a bunch of conveniences.
Absolutely right. It's good advice, and I certainly hope that your risk management background stays with you with every mile that you cycle.
Well, that's probably a great place to wrap it up. Was there anything else? That would be number one. And number two is, where can people follow you and find you and learn more about your work and your books?
The only thing I would say in terms of is there anything more is that you may not be surprised to know that I'm finishing up yet another book. I have a feeling that might result in conversation come January. This book is going to be a follow-on to my book, China Vision, which came out, as you mentioned, earlier this year. It's not going to be exactly the same thing. It's going to be talking about basically the choices the world has to make as a result of the conflict that's going on between the U.S. and China. So that's one thing. And then if people want to follow me, I'm certainly active in the Twitter sphere and LinkedIn and whatnot. But my website is countryrisksolutions.com. I put all of my writings and postings and things there. One-stop shopping.
Perfect. Daniel, this is great as always. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we will be speaking in a few months to talk about that new book.
Thanks so much, Ben. Great to talk as always.
All the best.
And you.
All right. I hope you all found that informative, as I usually do when I speak to Daniel. Check out Daniel and his work. Links are in the show notes as usual. Finally, if you like and want to support All Things Risk, one of the best ways you can do that is by leaving a positive rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. We will be back very soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.